So I've been doing some study around Ruth, and even the beginning of the Bible. I've kind of been doing just a Old Testament span because I've spent a lot of time in the New Testament recently. And so I was rereading Ruth, one of my favorite stories, and I started thinking, I was like, why did they go to Moab? Um, God wasn't thrilled with a lot of the countries around them. I remember Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, was a Moabite, and I was like, okay, so they kind of knew who God was, and they weren't like a completely corrupt nation, but where did they come from? And in Genesis, there's a lot of explanation on where different nationalities and groups of people come from. So I was like, I'll go look through. So I went back to the beginning, started looking through, find out where did the Moabites come from, because Ruth is a Moabite and winds up in Jesus's genealogy. And this is what I discovered. The Moabites came from Lot and his oldest daughter. And that's usually a story that we gloss over, we don't like talking about because it's not a good story. It's not something that we want to acknowledge as being a part of our spiritual history. And yet, it's there not just as a throwaway story, it's there because it's part of Jesus's family. And I think this just goes to show one of the reasons why it's so important that we acknowledge the messy pieces of our spiritual lineage is because humans are messy. And all of that messiness still brought Jesus into the world. God's plan still happened. And part of that plan was the messiness. Part of that plan was the parts of the story we don't want to talk about. And that's still true today. That even if you have parts of your history that you don't want to talk about, parts that you're embarrassed about, parts that are family skeletons, that doesn't mean God can't use you too. That doesn't mean God doesn't have a plan for your future. That doesn't mean that that piece that you don't want to talk about might lead to something bigger and better and be used ultimately for the good of others.